Chapter 18, Black Raven. At Caddock Academy, Dido was watching the time. It was 26 minutes past midnight. The boss of the Men in Black opened the radio connection with the pilot of the fighter bomber in good time. "Madam," said a cold, masculine voice, "I will have more than completed the objective within 3 minutes and 50 seconds. Dido felt that this was the most difficult decision that she has ever had to make in her whole career. She was about ready to give the order to attack. She trembled, but she needed to stop the terrorists at any cost. But she felt that the words were now refusing to form in her mouth. "Get ready to destroy the factory," she managed to mutter at last. Grigory Notopoulos regained consciousness, but he found himself shoved up in a corner, tied up and gagged. His clothes reeked of smoke. The man was pale and had an expression typical of someone who had had a bad day. Jeremy smiled wide at Weasel. The boy had noticed that someone in the maintenance shaft was trying to figure out how to get inside, so he immediately opened the door, freeing the agent, and the man was now aiming his weapon at Grigory Notopoulos. An expression of satisfaction could be seen on his face. Jeremy felt relieved as well. He had traced the movements of his friends thanks to the laptops that were still connected to the supercomputer. In reality, though, it was Xana who deserved the thanks for picking up on his presence in the real world and regularly sending detailed files his way at each crucial moment. He had already described how Aelita and Eva had saved Professor Hertz and the other adults, and how Ulrich and Richard had taken down the majority of the soldiers, and finally how Yumi and Odd had confronted Mago. The boy turned towards memory. "Why aren't we heading to the ground floor of the factory?" he said. "That's where all the others are, including Aelita." The woman gave a timid smile. "Well, it's just that I don't know if I'm ready. I mean, I'm dying to see her, but she won't even remember me. She might think that I abandoned her. Maybe she hates me." Jeremy sighed. Why must adults always be so complicated? "Aelita doesn't know you, it's true, but she's done everything she can to find you, and now she probably feels all alone. You need to run and go see her, hug her, and get to know her." The boy was interrupted by the computer at his feet as it began to emit an insistent alarm. Jeremy saw Xana's face on the screen. He was still in the tower on the Yoko and had a somber expression. "Did something happen?" Jeremy asked him. Xana nodded his head. "When you electrified the ground to stun Gregory, the internet connection to the factory was lost, and we've been isolated." Jeremy nodded. He'd known about that, but he'd figured it wasn't an urgent issue. It was more important for them to have taken out the Green Phoenix agent. "The connection came back for a brief moment," the young man with blonde hair continued. "Just long enough for me to intercept a communication from Dido. Actually, I think you were totally correct." "About what?" said Jeremy with a worried tone of voice. "About the government having a plan B in case they weren't able to stop the terrorists. I think that a plane is preparing to blow up the factory." "What?" cried Jeremy. "And when are they going to attack?" "If my calculations are correct, in 2 minutes, more or less. Unfortunately, we lost the internet again, and it would take hours for me to re-establish the connection. You need to find another way to get us in contact with Dido ASAP." Aelita was sitting at the center of the ground floor of the factory on the remains of what had once been the emerald green nomadic tent of Hannibal Mago. The factory was full of activity. The Men in Black were tending to the injured, giving them first aid, handcuffing the rest of Mago's soldiers, and deploying men who were still in condition to work to do something useful. She was with the people she loved, Yumi, Ulrich, Eva, and Odd, who had earlier come back out from the scanners, now without his powers. None of them spoke a single word. They didn't feel like it was the right time yet to speak of their adventures. Now was the time to take in the battlefield, breathe deeply, and enjoy the feeling of their freedom and accomplishments. Everything was perfect, or rather, it would have been perfect if the last person they were missing was there, Jeremy. Aelita wanted to see him again, hold him in her arms, and tell him how grateful she was for everything that he did. Of course, Jeremy's style was kind of reserved and serious, almost secretive. But without him, the kids wouldn't have been able to materialize into the real world, and then what happened could have been terrible. When the doors to the elevator opened, Aelita turned towards it with a large smile. She remained frozen in place. Jeremy wasn't alone. With him was another agent from the Men in Black, Weasel, and a woman with red hair who... "Jeremy told me that she was here," the young girl thought to herself with heartache. "But up until now, I was reluctant to believe it." Aelita was about to step in their direction when Jeremy began to yell out, "A radio! Someone give me a radio, quick!" 43 seconds until we reach the objective, ma'am," sounded the static-riddled voice of the pilot in Dido's ears. "Is authorization to open fire granted?" On Dido's screen in front of her was a small black dial showing the countdown. 40, 39. "I must release the bomb," continued the pilot, "or else I'll need to make a large turn to return to the factory for another shot." Dido felt the pressure of the moment and knew that the same concern as hers was behind the pilot's stoic voice, but she was the one who had to support the weight of this decision. "Okay," she murmured. "Prepare yourself. Authorization for attack at X hour granted." "Roger." At the same moment, Maggie's face appeared on her screen above the pilots. The secretary seemed stressed, almost distraught. "Ma'am! Stop Black Raven! They succeeded! The children succeeded!" Dido couldn't believe her ears. There were only 21 seconds remaining before the attack. At only 18 seconds left, she reopened her connection with the pilot. As she spoke with him, her heart was beating so strongly that she couldn't even hear her own voice. Jeremy placed the radio on the ground, one the leader of the Frogmen had given him. "I did it," he spoke softly. Oric gave him an affectionate punch to the shoulder. Everything that had just happened once the boy had arrived back on scene had been a complete surprise to them, and they didn't understand an iota of what had just taken place. "Mind explaining, genius?" Jeremy gave a timid smile to his father and fixed his glasses on the bridge of his nose. "Right, well, I managed to tell Dido to abort the attack. There was a plane that was about to bomb the factory." "What?" blurted Odd, jumping to his feet. Plane," Lone Wolf completed his sentence for him. "Operation Black Raven. I should have guessed that Dido would see herself obligated to put it in action." Jeremy raised a finger towards the ceiling. "Do you hear that? That's the noise of the fighter bomber that was about to disintegrate all of us." Odd broke out into applause. "Bravo!" he cried. "For Jeremy! Hip hip! Hooray!" Alita was watching the scene unfold from the corner of her eye. She felt it must be something important. However, she wasn't able to concentrate. The woman who had come out from the lift with Jeremy hadn't left her eyes. The cascade of red hair that went down to her shoulders and seemed to shine of its own light was the same color of her own in the real world when she was in her elf form on Lyoko. The woman had the same eyes as her, and the same fine lips that Alita saw when she looked in the mirror every morning. The nose, however, was different, as well as the shape of her face. The woman's face was softer and more friendly. Alita wanted to approach the woman, ask her if it was true, if it was really her. Yet, despite it all, she found herself unable to move or even to smile. It was as if an invisible storm was roaring inside of her, causing her to be frozen in place. A small beating knot that Alita felt in her chest knew perfectly well why she wasn't able to speak. This small, painful knot was telling her, "Don't get your hopes up. Don't kid yourself." She had already experienced it before. She had woken up on the supercomputer after a decade of sleep and found herself all alone. So all alone that she could no longer even remember having parents. She then discovered that her father was still alive, trapped on Lyoko in the form of a sphere of energy. But Alita was only able to spend a few minutes with him before he sacrificed himself to neutralize Xana back when the creature was still lacking human emotions. She later recovered the video in the Hermitage in which her father revealed to her that her mother was still alive and that Alita needed to find her. He had given her the necklace, and again. Things had been that way for such a long way. Struggling, believing, wishing, and then seeing all her hopes dashed, blown apart like a castle of cards destroyed by a gust of wind. She couldn't do it anymore. Alita had had enough of suffering. She was no longer able to take the first step. She was afraid, even if Jeremy had said that it was her. She felt her head turn. Around her, the world no longer existed. There was no factory, no men in black, no terrorists. Only herself and the woman with red hair. Very slowly, she saw her bring a hand to her neck, pull out a golden chain from under her shirt, and hold it between her fingers. At this same instant in time, Alita's necklace began to vibrate. Without completely understanding yet, without wanting to believe it yet, the young girl raised the necklace to her eyes. The A and the sailor's knot were shining intensely. The pink-haired woman nodded her head slowly. Alita realized that she couldn't see clearly. Her eyes were full of tears. The woman took a step forward. The small knot in Alita's chest melted like an ice cube under the sun, and the young girl opened her arms wide and began to run. Sobbing, she threw herself in the woman's arms. She felt great. She felt at home. This was her mother.